All right, so we got a really fascinating question from one of you listeners about carbon capture and utilization.
Oh, yeah.
Is it really like a big climate solution or just
Yeah.
kind of kicking the can down the road?
Uh-huh.
And we thought, you know what, let's really dive deep into this.
Yeah, let's do it.
We found this awesome paper to guide us. It's called Carbon Capture and Utilization, More Than Hiding CO2 for Some Time.
And I think what's really cool about this paper is, it has like all these authors
Yeah.
from all over the place, right? Like all different institutions, different countries, and they've all kind of come together
Yeah.
to really like give a good overview
Yeah.
of, what is CCU and what can we do with it?
Yeah, and one of the authors is Jan Mertens, who's the chief science officer at ENG.
Hmm.
And he's really been in this space for a while. Like he's worked in emerging energy technologies, sustainability assessment, and obviously carbon capture and carbon use.
Yeah, and energy is a pretty big
Yeah,
player
yeah,
in the energy space. So
for sure.
I think it's really valuable to have his definitely.
Perspective in there.
When we talk about decarbonization,
Right.
it's really easy to think of carbon as like the enemy.
Yeah.
But what this paper does a really good job of is saying like, hey, wait a minute.
Mm-hmm.
Let's rethink this a little bit. So our mission in this deep dive is to really unpack, what are the nuances of CCU?
Yeah.
Is it really going to help us or is it just kind of a temporary Band-Aid?
Right. And I think, the authors of this paper, they start by reminding us of like
Yeah.
the bigger picture, right? So we have the Paris Agreement. We need to reach carbon neutrality by 2050
Yeah.
to limit global warming to 1.5 degrees Celsius.
Uh,
So CCU kind of sits in this context of,
yeah.
overall, we need to increase energy efficiency.
Yeah.
We need more renewable electricity, but we're still going to need molecules, right?
For sure.
So CCU is kind of like
Yeah.
one piece of the puzzle.
Totally. Okay, so the paper jumps right into this concept of the misconception of decarbonization.
Yeah.
They say it's a misleading term.
Why is that such an important starting point for us?
Well, I think what they're trying to get at is that it's not really about getting rid of carbon altogether.
Okay.
It's more about,
Yeah.
not using fossil carbon,
Okay.
the carbon that we're digging up from the ground
Mm-hmm.
and burning and releasing into the atmosphere.
Right.
So they kind of prefer terms like defossilization or carbon neutrality
Got it.
because it's really about
Yeah.
creating a circular economy for carbon
Okay.
where, we're not just emitting it into the atmosphere,
Yeah.
but we're reusing it and capturing it and,
Yeah.
keeping it in the loop.
So it's not no carbon, it's no new
Exactly.
fossil carbon. Okay, cool. And this paper has this awesome figure 1,
Yeah.
that basically shows all the cool stuff we can do with captured CO2.
Right. So it's like this menu of options.
Yeah.
And they range from things that are already commercially available, like mineral carbonation.
Oh, yeah.
So,
Tell me about that.
yeah. So in mineral carbonation, we take CO2 and we react it with like alkaline materials.
Okay.
And this reaction is actually exothermic.
What does that mean?
It means it releases energy. So
Yeah.
it kind of helps us
Okay.
in the process.
Yeah.
And we create solid carbonates, which can be used for, building materials and things like that.
Oh, that's interesting. And there's another one, CO2 curing of cement.
Yeah. So we can actually use CO2 to
Oh,
make concrete stronger.
That's cool.
Yeah. It's pretty cool.
Awesome. Okay, so those are kind of like the things that are already out there.
Yeah.
And then there's all this other stuff that's more like,
Yeah, more futuristic.
yeah.
So we have things like biological conversion,
Yeah.
where we use microorganisms to
Mhm.
consume CO2 and turn it into useful products.
That's amazing.
Yeah, and then there's
Yeah.
all these different thermal catalytic methods where we use high temperatures and pressures
Correct.
to react CO2 with hydrogen.
Got it.
And then we have electrochemical and photoelectrochemical methods, which are kind of like artificial photosynthesis,
Wow.
where we can use electricity or sunlight to convert CO2 into different things.
Very cool. So we have the whole spectrum from like stuff that's
Exactly.
already happening to
Yeah.
like sci-fi stuff.
Exactly.
Okay, cool. So fact 1 that they talk about in the paper is the energy demand of CCU.
Uh-huh.
They say that CCU always requires a lot of energy
Mm-hmm.
and it has to be renewable energy.
Right.
Why is that so important?
Well, because CO2 is a very stable molecule.
Okay.
And to convert it into something useful, like a fuel or a chemical, we need to put in energy
Okay.
to overcome that stability.
Got it.
And if we're using fossil fuels to generate that energy,
Right.
then we're not really solving the problem.
Yeah, we're just shifting it around.
We're just shifting emissions around.
Okay. And this also ties into the fact that we're using more and more renewable electricity anyway.
Exactly.
We're
So
not-
we're going to need a lot of renewable electricity for things like electric vehicles, heat pumps, And then we're also going to need it to create these E-molecules,
Okay.
like hydrogen.
So tell me about E-molecules.
So E-molecules are basically molecules that are produced using renewable electricity.
Okay.
So, for example, we can use renewable electricity to split water
Uh-huh.
and create hydrogen.
Okay.
And then hydrogen can be used as a building block
Got it.
to create other molecules, like ammonia, methanol, methane.
Yeah, and the paper mentions e-fuels specifically,
Right.
like ammonia, methanol, and even sustainable jet fuel.
Yeah, and I think the key thing here is that these molecules can be used to transport renewable energy over long distances.
Oh, okay.
So, if we have a lot of solar energy in the Sahara Desert,
Yeah.
it's going to be much easier to ship
Yeah.
methanol or ammonia
Right.
across the ocean
Right.
than it is to transmit electricity.
That makes sense. And we talked about mineral carbonation earlier and how it's exothermic,
Right.
meaning it releases energy. Does
Mhm.
that mean it doesn't require a lot of energy?
So while the chemical reaction itself releases energy, the overall process still requires energy
Okay.
because you need energy to extract the raw materials, transport them, grind them up,
Right.
and then, control the reaction conditions.
So even though it releases energy, we still have to put some in the cell.
Exactly.
Got it. Okay, cool. So myth 2 that they address in the paper is that CCU is just delaying emissions,
Uh-huh.
but they argue that it's not just delaying emissions.
Right.
It can actually lead to real emission reductions.
Yeah, and I think the key here is that when CCU is powered by renewable electricity,
Yeah.
it's part of this transition to a circular economy
Okay.
where we're not continuously extracting
Right.
new fossil fuels.
Yeah.
We're actually using the CO2 that we've captured
Got it.
as a valuable raw material.
Okay, cool. And they have this other really interesting figure 2,
Yeah.
which shows how much emissions can be reduced
Mm-hmm.
with CCU.
So even in the near term, if we're capturing CO2 from fossil sources,
Uh-huh.
we can still reduce emissions by up to 50%.
Wow.
And then in the long term, if we're using biogenic CO2 or CO2 captured directly from the air,
Right.
we could potentially reach 100% emission reductions.
That's amazing.
Wow.
But they do say we should be careful about relying too much on fossil CO2 sources.
Right, because we don't want to create these lock-in effects
Yeah.
where we're kind of propping up the fossil fuel industry.
Right. Yeah.
So
yeah.
CCU should really be focused on those hard-to-abate emissions, like
Right.
from heavy industry or long-distance transport.
Got it. And what about going even further and actually removing more CO2 from the atmosphere than we emit?
Yeah, so to achieve carbon negativity,
Uh-huh.
we need to be using CO2 from biogenic sources
Yes.
or from direct air capture.
Okay.
And then we need to permanently store that CO2 underground.
Got it.
And of course, the whole process
Yeah.
from capture to utilization or storage
Right.
needs to be as low emission as possible.
Got it. And they give an example of e-methane. And they say that if you use biogenic CO2 and green hydrogen, you can reduce emissions by like 88 to 90%. But if you use fossil CO2, it cuts the savings in half.
Right.
So it really shows how important the source of energy is.
Exactly.
And they also talk about public perception,
Yeah.
which I think is really interesting because they say that there's a lack of understanding about CCU.
Mm.
And some people are worried that it's just greenwashing.
Right. And I think it's important to, communicate clearly
Yeah.
about the benefits of CCU.
Oh, sure.
And to make sure that it's done in a sustainable way.
Absolutely. Okay, so moving on to fact 2, they talk about direct air capture and utilization, or DACCU.
Yeah.
And they say that this has the potential to create a fully circular system for both CO2 and even water.
Yeah, so DSCU is basically where we capture CO2 directly from the air,
Right.
and then we can use that CO2 to create valuable products.
Okay.
And one of the really cool things about DACCU is that
Yeah.
it can also help us to close the loop on water.
Okay. How so?
So, when we produce e-fuels,
Uh-huh.
we also produce water as a byproduct. And that water can be used to supplement the water that we need for electrolysis.
Got it.
So we can create this kind of closed loop system.
And this is especially important in areas that are facing water scarcity.
Exactly.
Very cool. And they have a figure that shows this figure 3
Yeah.
that shows how this DACU system can integrate heat and water recovery.
Mm.
So it's not just about capturing carbon, it's
Mhm.
also about using resources more efficiently.
Yeah.
Okay.
A goal.
And what about the heat?
So the heat that's generated by the e-fuel synthesis process
Mm-hmm.
can sometimes be used to meet the heat demand of the DACC process.
Okay.
But sometimes it might not be enough.
Got it.
But if we also consider the heat from the electrolyzers,
Right.
then we actually have more than enough heat.
Wow.
And it's just a matter of,
Yeah.
capturing and utilizing that heat effectively.
So potentially a closed loop for energy as well.
Yeah.
Okay, cool. Now let's talk about the economics of all of this.
Yeah.
Myth 3 that they address is that e-molecules are just too expensive.
Right.
And they acknowledge that, yeah, right now it's tough to
Yeah.
compete with fossil fuels.
Yeah, and they give the example of natural gas prices in Europe,
Right.
which have been fluctuating a lot.
Yeah, for sure.
But they also introduce these concepts of social cost and social cost of carbon.
Now, for our listeners who maybe haven't heard these terms before,
Yeah.
can you break them down for us?
Sure. So the social cost is basically the cost that society bears
Okay.
due to some activity
Yeah.
that goes beyond the direct market price.
Right.
So, for example,
Yeah.
the social cost of driving a car
Uh-huh.
includes things like air pollution
Okay.
and traffic congestion.
Got it.
And the social cost of carbon, specifically,
Yeah.
is the cost that's associated with emitting 1 ton of CO2 into the atmosphere.
Okay.
And this includes the long-term impacts of climate change.
Right.
And there are projections that this cost could reach several hundreds of euros per ton of CO2
Wow.
after 2030.
So basically what they're saying is that when you factor in all these costs...
E-molecules might not be as expensive as they seem.
Exactly.
Right.
Because we're not accounting for all the negative externalities of fossil fuels.
Totally.
Yeah.
And they even mentioned something called the mortality cost of carbon.
Yeah, so this is kind of a more stark way of looking at it.
Yeah.
It's basically trying to estimate the number of deaths
Oh, wow.
that are caused by CO2 emissions.
That's intense.
Yeah, and so when we consider all of these costs,
Yeah.
it becomes clear that e-molecules are actually a much more economically viable option.
Okay, cool. So fact 3 that they talk about is using existing infrastructure.
Yeah.
Which seems like a huge advantage.
Right, so instead of building a whole new infrastructure for transporting and storing hydrogen,
Right.
we can actually use the existing infrastructure that we have for oil and gas.
Oh, wow.
So we can use pipelines.
Yeah.
We can use LNG terminals and tankers.
Wow.
We can even use oil tankers.
That's amazing. Yeah. And this is a huge advantage because it's much cheaper.
For sure.
And it's also more likely to be accepted by the public.
Right.
Because we're not building all this new stuff.
Totally. And they even talk about blending hydrogen into natural gas pipelines.
Yeah. So we can blend up to 20% hydrogen into existing methane pipelines.
Wow.
Without needing to make major modifications.
That's really cool. And they also talk about repurposing existing facilities.
Yeah. So for example,
Yeah.
we can repurpose Fischer-Tropsch synthesis plants
Okay.
to produce e-fuels.
Got it.
And for the chemical industry,
Yeah.
CCU can provide platform chemicals like methane and methanol.
Okay.
So the industry can kind of continue operating as it is.
Got it. But they do mention that we need to be careful about leaks.
Right. Because hydrogen and methane
Yeah.
are potent greenhouse gases.
Yeah.
So if they leak into the atmosphere,
Right.
that's bad.
Yeah. So we need to make sure that we have really good leak detection and prevention. Okay. So to kind of wrap this all up, it seems like CCU has the potential to be a really important part of the solution.
Yeah, I think the paper makes a really strong case
Yeah.
for CCU as a key technology
Yeah.
for achieving a circular carbon economy
Yeah.
and reducing emissions.
Absolutely. And, while the economics might be challenging right now in the long term, when you factor in things like the social cost of carbon, it starts to look a lot more promising.
Exactly.
And DACU in particular seems like a really interesting area.
Because of the potential for circularity and for integrating with other systems.
Oh, I think the big takeaway here is that we need to start thinking of captured CO2, not as a waste product, but as a valuable resource.
Exactly.
So here's something for you listeners to think about.
Okay.
If we really embrace this idea of captured CO2 as a resource, how could it change the way we do things? How could it change industrial processes, energy production, and even our whole understanding of decarbonization?
It's a really interesting question.
Yeah, it is. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive.
Yeah, thanks for having me.